Zcam announced the E2-S6 in March of 2019. They were kind enough to send me a test unit for comparison so I can make this video. In this video, I'm going to talk about the E2-S6, I'm going to compare it to the E2, and I'm just going to show what the footage looks like and talk about its features. In another video, I will compare it to the Blackmagic Pocket Cinema Camera 6K. Right now, let's just take a look at some of the footage. I should point out that because this is a pre-production unit, all of the features and specifications are subject to change, but as I was using it, I found that everything that I used worked just fine. It operated just like the E2 in that regard. All of the menu settings and features worked fine for me. This pre-production unit did not have Z-RAW in it, so I was not able to shoot in that format. And one more note, Zcam gave me absolutely no stipulations as far as what I could shoot with this camera or what I could talk about. I'm just free to give my own opinion on this camera. I didn't use any noise reduction anywhere in this video on any of the footage, including the footage from the Blackmagic Pocket Cinema Camera 6K, which I was using to film these two cameras. I just did a general color grade. I'm not really taking it in any specific direction, just trying to make it kind of a neutral but good looking image. Most of the color grading work was performed by the zcam LUTs. I dropped one on and it looked amazing, and I just made some corrections after that. So if you're not using the LUTs, you should definitely try them. They do a wonderful job on this footage. I wasn't able to pull focus for any of these shots because I was actually shooting with the Blackmagic Pocket Cinema Camera 6K at the same time. So if parts seem out of focus, that's probably why. Side by side, we can see that the width and height of the E2 and the E2-S6 are essentially the same. However, the depth is different. The S6 is quite a bit longer. You can see it really well here in the side shot. Part of that depth is the EF mount itself. It's a deeper flange distance to the sensor than Micro Four Thirds, so that's what you're seeing here, is it sticks out in the front beyond the body of the camera. The back has changed a little bit. I'll talk about that in a little bit. The bottom is also a little bit different. It appears to be the same, but it's not. So here I'll show you. There are two 1/4-20 threaded holes and a locating pin. So here's my base plate from my small rig cage, made for the E2. And of course it fits perfectly on the E2. The threaded holes line up with the mounting holes in the bottom of the plate. If I try this on the E2-S6, it mounts, it fits well, except the bottom hole doesn't quite line up. I'd have to drill out that bottom hole to make it connect. The upper hole does seem to line up okay. So it's a close fit. Of course, the camera is deeper, so it doesn't cover the entire bottom of the camera. But as you can see, it hugs the bottom quite well. The tilted cage fits all of the models of E2, including the new unreleased cameras, the S6, the F6, and the F8. The small rig cage, however, doesn't fit very well, which is unfortunate because I like this cage better than the tilted cage. Because of the depth, some of the mounting holes have changed position, so we can see that on the top, that hole doesn't line up when the side holes are more or less lined up. Also, I couldn't get it to quite sit flat on the top. I think the sides are shaped slightly differently. But anyway, those side holes don't quite line up. They're close. But that little flap of metal with additional holes gets right in the way of that CFast card slot. So you could cut it off, I suppose, and maybe make that work. So we can see that the threaded hole on the top just does not line up. If I move the cage down, and that hole is not even the correct hole because that's a threaded hole, and it just makes things worse. Now it's really covering up the CFast card slot, so that certainly wouldn't work. Here's another look at those top mounting holes. So the E2 has a single 1/4-20 and there is no locating hole. The E2-S6 has a 1/4-20 with RE locating pin holes and another locating pin. So that's going to be very, very nice to have for mounting cages and other accessories. Now on the back, the mounting holes are fortunately in the same position, or wisely in the same position. That means accessories like this V-mount battery plate from James Davis will fit on the newer camera. There's 4 mounting holes, and you can see how it leaves the connections open and accessible. And if you look at the other side, you can see that, yep, it clears all those ports, the Wi-Fi connector, antenna, Ethernet, the battery release, and the power, and the USB-C. So that's really good. The input power connector on the S6 is different than the E2. The E2 had a 4-pin LEMO. We now have a 2-pin LEMO. It works just the same as all the other LEMOs though. Push-pull on that barrel. Very easy to operate. Additionally, we have an auxiliary output on the opposite corner, so you can feed power to other devices. The Ethernet connector on the S6 is recessed and has a nice chamfered edge, whereas the E2, the connector is just flush. It's nice to see these little refinements. One major change to the camera is now the buttons and the CFast card slot are on the left side of the camera. I think this is fantastic. It's where everything should have been in the first place. Additionally, they've moved the direction of the door, so now that it opens to the back rather than to the front. It's a minor difference, but it seemed like this door was a little easier to open. It had a bit of a curve to it. I'm not sure if that was intentional or not. And let's talk about those buttons. The E2 has 3 custom function buttons and the power button. And the E2-S6 has 4 custom function buttons and the power button. All of those buttons are programmable, as well as the top buttons. The top buttons haven't changed. They do feel a little different than my E2, but it could just be my model. They still have the bounce, which means you'll get sometimes multiple presses out of one press, which kind of moves you around the menu in places where you don't want to go. It's been with the E2 since the beginning, and it's still here, unfortunately. There's been a lot of discussion over on the E2 Facebook group about the mount. If you haven't joined that group, you should do that because you could have had an active role in deciding the fate of the mount for these cameras. The E2 has a standard micro 4/3 mount, and it just uses standard micro 4/3 lenses. You can also adapt it with a number of different kinds of adapters. The E2-S6 has a Canon EF mount or PL mount. Here I have the Canon EF mount. But it's not your standard EF mount. It has a cinema style mount, which means that instead of rotating the lens and it snaps in with that pin, which would be spring loaded, here that pin is not spring loaded. It's a solid pin. You align the hole on the lens with the pin on the camera mount, and then turn that ring and it locks down on the flange of the lens. And there you have a mounted lens, and it's much more secure than your standard EF mount. This is a big benefit over cameras that have just a simple EF mount, where the lens will move a little bit because of that spring-loaded pin. The S6 has a slot for ND filters. At the time I was making this video, that electronic ND filter was not ready. So this is just a simple, I believe an IR filter maybe, I'm not exactly sure. But it slides in and out from the side. It's a very smooth, simple mechanism, and this is a very welcome feature. I want to run through a series of comparisons against the E2 to see if we can see what the difference is between a 4K camera and a 6K camera with a larger sensor. You might be seeing a different field of view, a different depth of focus, and maybe a cleaner image, we would hope. That's kind of what you'd expect to get from a larger sensor. So let's see what we get. So in this first shot, we have both cameras in Cinema 4K. Both of these cameras are going to look really good in this shot because we're at native ISOs. We have a lot of light to play with. They don't have to work very hard. They're going to give you a great image. But if you look, maybe you can see a little more detail on the S6. It's hard to say. You'd have to have a large screen to see the difference, or zoom in 200%. I suppose I could zoom it in for you. So here's 200%. You tell me if you see a difference. The S6 appears to have more detail, and it also looks sharper. Now, I'm actually not sure if this is due to the sensor and the higher resolution being subsampled down to 4K, or if it's the focus, because it's difficult to manage 2 cameras rolling at the same time. I have to worry about exposure and framing, and sometimes my focus isn't on perfectly, so that might be part of it here. Here I've moved to VFR 60 so we can see how it looks in a higher frame rate. And one thing you'll notice is the S6 has cropped in. If we look at the specifications on the website, we can see that we can either crop or super sample at certain resolutions and frame rates. And I didn't notice this in the camera. I didn't see a setting for it. It might be there and I just didn't see it. So by default, it cropped in a little bit. I would have set it to super sample so that I get the wider field of view, but it's nice to have the option in case you want to have kind of an in-camera zoom feature. I've moved back to a base frame rate of 23976, but I've applied a lot more ND and I've put the apertures up to f22 so that I have to move the ISOs way up. This is a high ISO noise test. The E2 is at ISO 16,000 and the E2-S6 is at ISO 12,800. Those are the equivalent number of ISO steps from their base ISO to that high ISO setting. When you push these cameras like this, you really start to see the difference between these sensors. The S6 has substantially less noise in the image. The E2 is just crawling with noise. It's probably okay. It's not great. I wouldn't use it like this. I would at least apply some noise reduction to the E2 footage. I'd probably apply noise reduction to the S6 footage as well, but it's already a better looking image to begin with. And once again, I've moved to VFR 60, so this is still high ISOs of 12,800 and 16,000, but at a higher frame rate. It's kind of the same story. We have a lot more noise in the E2 than in the S6. You might notice that even though this is the same shot, I haven't changed position, I just changed the light level hitting the sensor. The image has degraded quite a bit. We have less information in the water. The color has degraded. It's because we're at high ISOs and high frame rates. A Super 35 sensor has a couple of immediate benefits over Micro Four Thirds. You'll get a shallower depth of focus, meaning the focus is narrower, and you'll also get a wider field of view. Let's talk about that one first. Here's the E2-S6, so take a look at this field of view, the width of the frame, how much is in this shot, and then I'll compare it to the E2. We can see right away that the E2 doesn't have as wide of a field of view. The Micro Four Thirds size sensor makes any lens you put on appear narrower. You can't talk about Micro Four Thirds, however, without talking about focal reducers, or the brand name Speed Booster by Metabones. And I have one here, and you can see that I'm actually getting a much wider field of view than Super 35 with that Speed Booster. It's harder to see the difference in the depth of focus, partially because the Micro Four Thirds sensor gives you that crop factor. So as we see here, it looks like it has a shallower depth of field, but it's probably just because we're closer to the object. With the Speed Booster, things look a little more similar, and then we start to see that, yeah, it's really hard to tell whether one has a shallower depth of focus or not. The Speed Booster gives us a shallower depth of field, and it reduces the optical difference between the two sensor sizes. I haven't actually talked about the most important aspect of this camera. That would be the 6K resolution. So let's look at the resolution and see what this camera is really giving us. In 6K open gate, the highest resolution you'll get is 6244 by 4168, and this is what it looks like if I scale it down to fit in a 4K window. Pixel to pixel, this is what the actual resolution looks like. As I move through the other resolutions, I'm going to superimpose them on top of this one, since this one will contain all of them, and you can see how they compare. These higher resolution modes are a simple crop of the full sensor readout. In fact, you can see where my framing got moved just a little bit. The trees don't quite line up with the 6K open gate image. 5K sounds like a drop in resolution until you realize that it's the full vertical size of the sensor and just a little bit off the edges. That's a lot of pixels to play with. When you get down to these lower resolutions, you can see that it's doing a super sampling of the image. It's using the full width, or nearly the full width of the sensor, and scaling it down so you're getting the benefit of a larger sensor with all those pixels into a 4K image or an HD image. And I almost feel sorry for little HD here. You can see how many HD images you could fit inside of that 6K image. And again, at a higher frame rate, it jumped to a crop, and I believe there should be a menu setting that lets you select whether you want the crop or the super sampling. Let's look at the roadmap of the E2 cameras. Back in September of 2018, we have the release of the E2, and its foremost feature is it does 4K 120 frames per second. In the spring of 2018, we had the release of the E2G, which is a global shutter camera. Then we have the E2C, which is a more compact, only does 4K 30 camera, so it's also a lot cheaper. And then we have now the E2-S6 coming out in October. And also we have the full frame cameras. I think what we're seeing is the progression of technology and affordability. As the components become more affordable and more accessible, we're getting to see some higher technology, some better specs coming down in price. And that's great for us as consumers. We get better cameras, they can shoot a lot better video for a lot less money than they used to cost. That's what we have with the E2-S6. It's a progression, a step forward. It's a bump in specs. We're getting 6K resolution now. We're getting a larger sensor, so there's less noise. We're getting a locking EF mount, some little features and some big features that add up to a better product. I want to thank Zcam and everybody over there, I call them the Z team, for sending me this camera for review. I really, really appreciate it. If you haven't subscribed yet, be sure to do that because I have another video coming up where I'm going to compare this against the Blackmagic Pocket Cinema Camera 6K. You don't want to miss that one. And I also probably have something coming up in the future that you'll be very interested in. So be sure to hit that like and subscribe and hit that little bell icon to know when I post my next video. I'll see you then.